It did take a moment for that to go in.
Oh, there it is.
There you go.
Okay. All right. So.
Okay, great. Person number one is here.
I don't know.
I don't know. It's really fun to work around the clean area. Person number four. Nice to meet you.
Is Craig or Emily here from Texas State? Does anybody know them? Okay, they have Blue Man Group tickets, maybe. He had his gal bars for to be here. And then Carly. Carly.
Oh, wow.
All right. Well, we did extra long.
We can give him an extra few minutes, maybe.
Or we
Yeah, we're good with that.
hit give him like another couple minutes. Hit dinner early.
I'll get a cookie in the meantime.
Extended cookie break.
Yeah.
Oh. The most sugar high panel in all the land.
Talk about the I should have done that the last panel. I'm just gonna go see if there's.
Isn't here? It kind of works.
Yeah, it's all right.
Horrible, but.
Maybe they'll come. Yeah, maybe they'll come in late.
Work.
Yeah. I'm not sure where she went either.
All right, well, I guess we can get started. My name is Tim Dale, and I'm from the University of Wisconsin La Crosse. And since we have maybe a smaller group, it might work okay if we turn around real quickly. Since we have 2 people not here, we can just maybe say who we are and the institution we're from, and maybe our field of study. I think this is going to be a particularly interesting panel because we will have an interdisciplinary approach to some of these questions of social media and omnipresent media. So again, Tim Dale, University of Wisconsin La Crosse, and I am a political scientist. We'll get to you at the end. Oh, that's great.
Thank you, aloha and mahalo from University of Hawaii at Manoa. And so I guess this is the 9th island. So I'm here, Las Vegas, Hawaii, it's a big connection. I'm Daphne Jesser, and I'm in the English department, but I specialize particularly in rhetoric. So it's like a rhetoric reference by the side people of the room, Rory, Aristotle, and so looking forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you for having me.
Oh, we're all interested. Hi, I'm not on the panel. Steve Rosenstein, New York City College of Technology. Mostly I teach in the English department there, technical writing. But I also just presented here at the panel on Holocaust motifs in 1950s horror comics. So just kind of a general scholar about that.
Hello everyone, Brooke Carlson, also from Hawaii, Chaminade University, and my field is early modern English literature, but I teach a lot of composition, and so I do that really as a generalist through literature. I use Twitter and Instagram in teaching, and so the idea of the digital humanities and who we are, I think is really important, especially in the 21st century world where we both are and are not, depending on our electricity, perhaps. So I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you.
I'm Steve Winterberg. I teach at George Fox University outside of Portland, Oregon. My field is anthropology, international studies is what I teach at.
Stephen Rushley, Truman State University in Missouri, where else? And a historian, and my main research is on Old Oromish.
Just visiting.
You can still say.
What's your name? Just visiting.
Well, I'm his wife. I'm a Methodist pastor, actually. So
You
theology, yes.
I'm Professor Donna Bryan from Australia, Central Queensland University. Professor there is like a chair. I'm a research chair in creative industries, specialising in creative writing.
Johnson Quijano, Tarrant County College and University of Texas at Arlington. English department on both accounts, and I teach rhetoric, media, and game studies.
Darren Payne, I'm also from the University of Hawaii, teach rhetoric and popular culture and digital humanities oriented stuffs.
Stops.
That's that on my resume.
Oh, sorry. Yeah,
No, I
Hawaii,
like it.
that's Hawaii term.
Hi everybody, I'm Megan Ryan, that's me up there. I'm representing Fielding Graduate University in beautiful Santa Barbara, California. When I'm not there, I am a media psychologist just outside of Philadelphia. And I totally understand the teaching composition woes. My previous life, I was an English professor in the state system of Pennsylvania.
And, hi, my name is Joseph Foy. I'm currently serving as the Associate Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs at the University of Wisconsin Colleges, and I also have a background in political science. Okay, thank you everyone. Look forward to an engaging conversation. And given the kind of different angles that the papers are taking, I thought it might be good to have time after each presentation for a conversation. I think that gives each presentation its due. And so maybe we'll have 10 to 15 minutes of a presentation and then a discussion that Could be longer, shorter, depending on what you want to do in terms of the conversation. But I think that'll be the best way to proceed. And as Megan suggested, she's now first on the agenda, so go ahead.
Who would have thought? All right, so it's kind of a little labor of love that you're about to hear. So we are quickly approaching the second decade of social media. These sites and apps are easily integrated into daily life. As a primary method of communication, Facebook also becomes a tool for nostalgia. Facebook induces nostalgia through meme culture, through a clicker not working. All right. All right, there we go. Through meme culture, pop culture tributes, and user-created groups such as I Love the 80s, Remember When, and so forth. I also see in my current research on therapeutic communication. Facebook connects people through their common interests, both past and present. Facebook fits in what Dr. Sudeikis calls nostalgic repository. My goodness, excuse me. It is a place where people can look back and even possibly feel better through their posts and interactions online. So I'm going to ask you to think back, way back, to a prehistoric time, also known as 2004. The Y2K hysteria has finally cooled down. You've got mail or instant messenger dings were familiar sounds at the workplace and at home. Computers were no longer props in science fiction television shows. Computers were a popular item. They were great gifts for high school graduation. They were portable enough to travel on their own. They could go on business trips, and they were easily internet accessible. It seems society was doing just fine, but there was slowly becoming a trickle of impatience for processing speeds. Now accustomed to the internet in 2004, people wanted their information faster. They successfully adapted to strange processing acronyms like DSL, leaving behind the horrifying dial-up modem sounds. Then along came social media. Social networking sites, later shortened to social media, truly made the internet feel like a more worldwide web. Web 2.0 allowed for people to connect for pleasure and for business with colleagues, friends, family, and even complete strangers. Facebook entered the scene in early February 2004 as a collegiate networking site. By September 2006, it expanded to include all internet users with valid email or mobile phone login. Connections developed from schools, families, cities, businesses, and of course the entertainment industry. A noticeable algorithm change was a suggestion of the people you may know feature, which predicted friends or future friends for the user. These predictions were based on similar interests, locations, similar schools, mutual friends, having some kind of activity in common, like liking a post, or later we would call it reacting to a post. The algorithm was well known by October 2009 when the user's landing page changed from the popularity-based newsfeed. The newsfeed originally showed just posts from friended, I love that that's a verb, friended users. And now, as of October in 2009, the predicted or pre-processed posts mostly came from outside companies and corporations, no longer just personal friends. So this is ads abound. It solidified Facebook's place in a consumer-driven culture. By September 2011, Facebook combined its popularity-based feed with the user-based feed, so the original Friends news, in order to create one universal landing page which included international news, trending topics, Friends posts, shared content. Facebook's reign was well known by April 2012 when it purchased Instagram, and it continues today to purchase a variety of things in front of us, in the public eye, and behind the scenes. Earlier there was a little timeline. They are now in the virtual reality world. So just to kind of, we don't have Facebook virtual reality yet, but they're there. By April 2012 is when they purchased Instagram. Later they merged in 2012 as well with, you can log in to other websites. So you no longer need to create all these separate different accounts for separate different things. If you shop at Target, you can have your own account through Facebook and things of the such. So you'd never have to create or recreate a new user profile ever again, just use your Facebook profile. Facebook continued with its acquisitions in 2015, purchasing WhatsApp, some augmented reality, some virtual reality, which we still haven't seen the final results of just yet. So that's some of what they're up to. So what does nostalgia have to do with Facebook? That's obviously the idea of this presentation. So Facebook isn't the newest, hippest thing, but yet it's still one of the most frequently visited websites and downloaded apps in the world. While the average demographics have changed for the users, it's created a culture of sharing amongst its many groups, communities and individual users. Facebook is a way to connect or reconnect with any user. Have a favorite musician from high school? He or she is probably on there. Remember your middle school crush? You can find them on there. Happen to go to Las Vegas? Shows, hotels, casinos all have Facebook presence. Our beloved conference has a Facebook presence. And your favorite brand of cereal even has a Facebook page. Simply put, nostalgia is a way of looking back. Over the years, nostalgia has been defined first for the worse and now for the better. Nostalgia was first mentioned in the late 1600s. In the very beginning, nostalgia was considered to be a mental disorder. Dr. Hofer of Switzerland is the first to be quoted for describing nostalgia, and he called it a demonic cause, a neurological problem, and a disease. If you skip ahead a few years later, it's attributed to homesickness and pain. In the 1800s, nostalgia was referred to as an immigrant's concern, so it's an immigrant's mental issue that led to melancholy. In the 1900s, nostalgia was portrayed as a mental compulsive disorder. In the 1980s, so this is still kind of current for us, in the 1980s, nostalgia was argued to be a psychological problem related to self-discontinuing, which encouraged patients not to use the past to compare their present selves, even if it had positive connotations. It wasn't until the 2000s that nostalgia's name was finally cleared from reference of psychological harm. So in the 2000s, Dr. Konstantin Sudeikis, who's here, of the University of Southampton, decided to clear nostalgia's good name. He argues that it is not a disorder. In a New York Times interview, he states that nostalgia provides a texture for life. He divulges that nostalgia has shown to counteract loneliness, boredom, and anxiety. Same arguments made for Facebook. It makes people who more generous to strangers and more tolerant of outsiders. Couples feel closer, and this is still his quote, couples feel closer and look happier when sharing nostalgic memories. On cold days or in cold rooms, people use nostalgia to literally feel warmer. The items here on his bullet points, these are studies that he and his colleagues have done, and they can actually prove that nostalgia could make you feel warmer. There are actually studies to prove these points, but when you get down to it, what exactly is nostalgia? Well, we have the picture of arguably the foremost expert on nostalgia currently. He says that it's all part of the human experience. It relates back to identity formation. Nostalgia made him feel that his life had roots and continuality. It made him feel good about himself and his relationships. In regard to his description on nostalgia as texture, his main points are that nostalgia makes us feel a bit more human. It gives us strength to move forward. Translation, nostalgia is most likely a bittersweet feeling. Something or someone triggers a person's memory. There may be both happy and sad emotions with that nostalgic moment that always refers to the past. Nostalgia is production. Dr. Tim Wildshoe, who is a colleague and a research partner, claims that nostalgia is powerful because its topics are universal. Their experiences such as, according to Wildshoe, reminiscences about friends, family, holidays, weddings, songs, sunsets, lakes, list goes on. And the stories tend to feature the self as the protagonist. For this study, the nostalgic themes are broken down into some different realms. The first is going to be trendy hashtags, then tools and technology, media and personal connections, and societal roles. As the primary population on Facebook matures or ages, the nostalgia producers increase. This is seen through group formations, individual posts, and Facebook features or apps. So we'll start with trendy hashtags. Trendy hashtags is the first realm to discuss. On Thursdays, it's customary to post a throwback photo of yourself or something key to your identity. All 7 days are covered from Memory Monday to Send Me Back Saturday. These are great times to post or even scan old photos with captions such as, here's me at a popular age, or a certain year, or give a nod to from way back when. There are many groups on Facebook whose sole purpose is to appreciate items of the past. These include cars, toys, and other consumer goods that could easily be classified as vintage. There's a rumor that the style of jeans someone wears indicates what decade they attended high school. Thankfully, we have tablecloths, so nobody can look for those bell bottoms. For fashion, in the particular everyday casual wear for us everyday people, it often floods memory banks. Aside from memes about the fabulous fashion, There are legitimate collectors groups who organize on Facebook. A popular theme are colorful debates about automobiles. Toy cars are no exception, as another popular category to drum up nostalgia includes posts about the quality of toys from years gone by. Same with automobiles, the quality of style, the quality of the parts, and so on. Each item has its own appreciation group on Facebook where fans vow to uphold their values and keep their item in current conversation. How postmodern is it for people to discuss older, even outdated technology over social media, especially when with this previous technology is being presented over the aging Facebook? Following an evolution of technologies on Facebook is also a popular way to induce nostalgia. Groups such as Memory Lane and The Old School pay homage to outdated technologies of yesteryear. They stir up nostalgic feelings by asking their group members where were you when a certain product came out. They take polls and they listen to how people listen to their music, vinyls, 8-tracks, cassettes, and so on. There's even a shared meme that pities the younger generation for not knowing what the Sony Walkman was. And that's probably my favorite one. In media, nostalgia lives in a place called The Old School. It's a scrappy place filled with passion, determination, and even some grit. The Old School used these tools and technologies of the past to entertain the world and share its messages. You name the decade or the genre, and there is a dedicated place to nostalgize those favorite jams. Nostalgize is a invented verb form from the Southampton Research Group. So much like Facebook can create friending. In the Netherlands, Tilburg University researchers studied the role of music. It should be no surprise to anyone at this conference that music has a profound impact on the musicians and the listeners. Songs can take someone back to the time, oh wait, there's nostalgia again. A quick lyric search will lead to dozens of songs with titles and phrases like taking back or going back or a different type of place that the singer remembers. This leads to the personal and societal realms. Facebook users can create and interact with nostalgia in a variety of ways. The On This Day feature is part of the website's platform, and it pulls at the bittersweet heartstrings of users. In 2015, Facebook introduced a new method of sharing statuses with this feature. Geller, who's a product manager for Facebook, cites, people often look back at old photos or older memories they've shared on Facebook, and many have told us here that they would like to enjoy products and features that would make this easier. The On This Day feature allows users to review previous posts from past years. It's a private section of the platform that shows what content the user posted on the present calendar day and annual anniversaries of the same date. If the user sees something they would like to share on their page, they can easily repost this in the feature. The previous content becomes a new post placed in an On This Day frame on the user's page. They can also add new commentary to keep whatever happened in the anniversary in conversation today. For Orno, she summarizes this feature as a way for people to dive back into the digital archives of their lives. In her interviews with the Facebook researchers, she found that Facebook uses its usual batch of algorithms, personal preferences, and artificial intelligence to predict the types of posts people would want to see appear on the On This Day feature. Her interviewees, who are the Facebook technicians, stated people didn't actually care that much about pictures of food that they've taken in the past. The users favored posts with words like miss or themes of love. She claimed that Facebook users preferred seeing these more personal and emotional memories rather than every post they've ever made. In 2016, it was reported that 60 million people use this feature worldwide. While there is not a current count for how many people use this On This Day feature, Facebook continues to promote it. Facebook technicians announce new features that will make this even more personalized. While the platform cannot predict current feelings, the algorithms can suggest what type of sensitive information to show. For instance, in interviews with Facebook technicians, Weinberger learned that Facebook does not want to resurface everything, and sometimes the algorithms can get it wrong. In the newest update of the On This Day feature, it includes the availability to customize which content is recalled by Facebook. This is an attempt to prevent contamination sequences, which occur when a previously good memory becomes an unpleasant feeling in the current time. Using this customizational tool allows for a user to tell the system what to show and what not to show. So they can block certain dates, certain people, and so on. in a way that can curb the bitterness of the bittersweet nostalgic moments. The user can also join groups, communities, or interact with posts about nostalgic and personal beliefs. Pages and posts about generations tend to ring home with those personal connections and societal roles. You know you're from, insert your town name here or your state name here. Pages rehash what life was like growing up in certain locations. Only kids from X amount of decade memes will revisit popular yet dated ways of life for those of that age group. Aside from ages, those who appreciate certain decades will find solace in pages specifically dedicated to their beloved decades, such as I Heart the 80s, or other titles that imply decade plus whatever time is cool. In my current research, nostalgia is going to return back to its bittersweet functionality. Facebook users use personal recollections during bereavement. In terms of bereavement, the person may try to find meanings and ways to remember their deceased loved one. During bereavement, the user-created narrative helps the person cope with the loss by remembering the connections to the deceased. This is through the act of remembrance, when a person uses the narrative as a way to remember someone by preserving their memory through story. Facebook provides the venue to easily do that. Milestones, tributes, and other user-created examples are examples of remembrance. My dissertation defined two categories, milestones and tributes. Milestones are posts that represent annual anniversaries of the user and the deceased, so something that they would have in common. For example, the survivor may post about the deceased person's birthday, or they might mention how old the deceased would have been this year on this date. Tributes, on the other hand, are defined as an ordinary post that is not sparked by any particular milestone. The tribute post is made whenever the user feels the need to pay homage to the deceased person. So we're applying positive psychology much to the line of Sudeikis' work, who's out of the University of Southampton. The relationship between nostalgia, and since I bummed you out about death, I'm going to show you happy things now. The relationship between Facebook and nostalgia is at a current point of comparison. Many of these posts and groups discuss the feature of this is better than that tone. In the competition of past versus present, the past is usually the victor. Sudeikis hopes that this is a misconception and that nostalgia will prove that it's a more positive feeling and the this is better than that will fade away. He argues that nostalgic moments will become positive experiences building on the repository. People will feel better because they can turn to nostalgia experience for psychological life boost or some kind of other extra motivation. When discussing nostalgia, the primary focuses are on experiences and memories. Sudeikis summarizes his argument by quoting Casablanca, because if you can put pop culture in your dissertation and your research, you're golden. So he says, we'll always have Paris. That's nostalgia for you. We have it and nobody can take it away from us. It's our prized possession. Of course, there's a plethora of literature out there that will tell you that all social media equates to vanity and narcissism. And it has its valid points, you can all agree. But there are also some people there's also some people who may take it too far. So here's kind of a translation. We have our dedication post, Grandma and Grandpa. Person is remembering their grandparents. Then we have a group who just really likes old school Las Vegas. Excellent. And then we have somebody who's taken it way too far, and she actually refers to herself as stuck in the 70s chick. And she does not respond to any kind of current news stories. This account stops the world in 1979. There's a little bit of everything here in this study. Future research will need to follow the current technology trends. Facebook simply cannot attract the younger crowds like it used to. While it has integrated new features and compatible apps, the trend tends to lean towards a person becoming a multi-platform self. As we've seen, nostalgia will always be around. If it can fight off those terrible reviews from the 1800s, a new social media platform or a new trend will not stop people from nostalgizing anytime soon. Perhaps in the years to come, we'll all look back and remember this funny little blue and white website that was once a daily habit.
Thank you. We do have time for questions, but I might claim the privilege of asking the first. That's okay. I really like the diagnosis of nostalgia as a disorder. I think I have some of those disorders that we wouldn't even call nostalgia, just the self-disassociating or whatever that was. I wonder about the communal nature of nostalgia. I noticed those nostalgia websites are click if you agree. And so social media is attempting to build a community around nostalgia. And so in terms of the history of nostalgia, it seems like an alienating, isolating disorder. But in the age of social media, it's the opposite. There's this, so it's not nostalgia in I'm remembering this. It's actually, I really want to know that other people remember it too. So I wonder if you had thoughts about nostalgia as community building as opposed to just nostalgia as individual reflection on some unique past.
Yeah, I think Facebook is what added that community building feature. So for instance, without making you all dizzy and going back through all the slides, those groups, I'm from whatever town I grew up in, when you request to join, many of those groups will write back, like, okay, so you live there, prove it.
Yeah.
Selective community, perhaps. So would a millennial be allowed to join 70s chick? I can't get over that that's how she wants to go by. But would they be allowed to talk with her? Or does it become some kind of weird online debate, which everybody loves to do because we get trolled from our screens? So yeah, I think it's community building, and it's kind of that reaching out for that one last straw. Oh man, Walkman. Soon nobody will know what a Walkman is. Kind of interesting to see. Yeah.
Other thoughts, questions?
Well, you just helped me put a little piece of a puzzle together, I think, in talking about nostalgia. One of the things I look at is memoirs of Holocaust, second generation, third generation Holocaust survivors. And I was wondering, as you were talking about, what happens if there is a disruption and you can no longer go back to that place, that community is gone.
Right.
So you're talking about it's a community identity formation, and it's a source of happiness or a way of working against loneliness and isolation. What happens if that community is entirely destroyed and doesn't exist? Then you've been stripped of that possibility to go back, except in one's imagination.
Right.
Right. So that really put an interesting twist, I think, on the whole concept of going back to a place.
Yeah.
For certain, and it wouldn't be, it would be, if you connect memory to trauma, then any place that's experienced trauma, in which maybe the place doesn't really exist in the same way as it did in one's childhood, then how do you return?
Right.
So yeah, thank you for that. It was really it's an interesting moment.
Well,
So I don't know if you've, not that you
future
have to have done this at all, but have you seen anything on sort of nostalgia and trauma?
I've seen a few as like survivor group type things, and
Yeah.
a lot of the reaction is when the person joins the group again, it's kind of like a private, you have to message the group
Yes.
creator thing. There's that first initial boom wave of sadness, hurt, whatever it might be. There's some kind of boom, grief, pain, and then all of a sudden, like a swarm, all of the other users come by and like group hug, and then it becomes positive until the next person shows up, and then boom. And I wonder what it does when the person finally puts down the screen and walks away. The idea of you can't physically go back, there's actually a group that's out of New Jersey that's called Things That Aren't There Anymore. And again, you kind of need to prove your allegiance to get into the group. It's a collective group. I think it's public, like we could all search it. But then when you contact the creator, they will ask you to, okay, yeah, you say you're from Jersey, show it. Things that are no longer there will have people scanning in photos a lot of the times of old amusement parks, of here is this wonderful, I always think of like the Dirty Dancing resort. Here's this wonderful resort that was once in northern New Jersey. Well, apparently horrible fire, people's lives were lost, etc. in the 50s. And so people will post like the old pamphlets. So somebody's sitting there, double-sided, scanning the old vacation pamphlets. And again, not to bring up all these people died, but this item's no longer there, and it was a staple to my town, and I want to represent it somehow. And plus, it's got a cool name for a Facebook group, Things That Are No Longer There.
So do you see this just as a kind of a collective effort at memorializing Or is there a different impetus?
Well, the Diane here, she's definitely in the memorializing, and she's somewhere in her process of bereavement, and maybe there's this one. There was also another one I was torn between picking this one from Diane, whom I don't know. I just wrote to her and said, "Hey, can I use your post?" And she was, "Yeah, go ahead." And then there's another girl named Denise who's the executor of her grandparents' will, and she's selling the grandparents' house. And so she's cleaning up, and she did a very similar post. She actually found a like a Mad Libs kind of thing from back in the day, and she found a picture of Grandpa at 2, and it screams memorializing in that sense. And then there's some people who definitely just can't let it go. On our far right there, so we're either memorializing actual people, places, things, or we get to a place where I don't know how long she spends, 70th Street, I don't know how long she spends online. It seems like she's there a lot. So why is she avoiding the real world? Why hasn't she recognized 1980 or beyond? So I don't know if she's memorializing so much as she's hiding, withdrawing, literally stuck because of her, yeah. Or this could all just be a creative piece too, which, and then kudos to her because she's fooled a bunch of us.
You sort of addressed this with this idea of the past is better than that sort of.
That seems to be, yeah, what a lot of the people are saying. I don't necessarily know if I agree, but it seems like that's where it's at right now, trend-wise.
Yeah, so I mean, even like in Diane's post, for example, there's a sense that that she's still living in the present and the reality sort of the suffering of her grandfather's passing. But I'm just sort of curious, like this idea of, you know, I'm like thinking through, like we don't, there's conditioning and there's what's acceptable sort of on social media platforms. And so you don't have, like I'm sort of struck by several years ago, a friend's relationship broke up and the girl like posted this long sort of drawn out, everyone sort of felt uncomfortable, didn't know what to do with it.
And the little icon of the broken heart. And
right, yes, and then 2 years later her ex-boyfriend got married and there's this whole other post, right, and so I'm sort of struck
and
in some, right, and how there's a measure of conditioning that we put that down, right, like there's a sort of negative social sanction, if you will, that goes along with that. So then we remember, we remember this, because this is still looking at the past fondly, right, but we don't remember on Facebook at least, or on social media, you know, my son's first week of life where he's crying all night. I don't have videos of that, or we're not sleeping for...
It's not the cute part.
Right.
Yeah.
So I'm curious how that sort of connects to this idea of nostalgia, and what we choose to remember, at least on social media platforms, tends to be the positive. It's our vacations and it's our...
Right, and even with the On This Day feature, originally it was bringing up every post you made, ever. So, girl telling off ex-boyfriend in Long Dryer Drive with a little broken heart, that would come up, along with the picture of her lunch, along with her puppy, and if I had to pick out of 3 of those, I'm picking the picture of the puppy. So I don't know how long this went on for, because 2015 is when they released the feature. And then they acquired all this technology also in 2015. So they had artificial intelligence in the way to kind of customize their algorithms so none of us got creeped out by it. And now it's, you know, as of 2017, they didn't have a number anymore for how many people use this On This Day feature. But I see it from time to time yet. So maybe it's kind of helping mold. I mean, it does hide news stories from us, so I can't imagine it wouldn't hide other things from us.
What do you mean when you say that they don't have a number for that?
They don't have, they actually had a count of how many users went into the On This Day. And now they don't have that, it's not publicly available. So I can't imagine that it's a high number anymore. Because usually when Facebook does something and it's very popular, there's skywriting. Yeah.
Well, I think we should move on. I do think before the end of the day we should take a picture of all of us here, so a year from now.
It can go on This Day. Yeah.
We were at.
That goes on the, what was it? Things that are no longer there.
Things that are no longer there.
Did you have another question though? I guess we get.
You talked about like Facebook groups, memes, which are kind of like a form of remixing, and then his talk about nostalgia, going back to an idyllic world. And I'm wondering, what do you make of the idea of that kind of communal nostalgic past being more fiction than reality?
Oh, that could get very, very fun and messy. that's my initial like, oh, tell me more. I've seen a lot of not necessarily hostile posts in some of those the past is better than now groups, but I can see how it could escalate very, very quickly. Simply in the idea of like the PlayStation meme. Like, this is the original PlayStation. Kids these days, da 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 da. And then in comes the parent with a kid of these days, and yeah. I see a lot of tightrope walking for this. We should just watch. We should get some popcorn and just watch. I think that's going to be my official answer.
All right, cool.
Yeah.
Michael Jackson meme.
Yeah. And we'll take a picture of it.
Shouldn't have been so fun. Okay. We now have Daphne Dessler, who's going to talk about reconsidering memory in the digital era.
All right, well, I should warn you that this is part of a larger project, and so it may seem a bit decontextualized as I kind of try to clue in. It's actually the project is looking at the memoirs of second generation, third generation Holocaust survivors. And so I deal with memory from that vantage point. And because second generation, third generation Holocaust survivors are part of the digital era, it all sort of ends up being relevant. And there's something else I was going to say about that just popped out of me. But I teach memoir writing, autobiographical writing, and so it also has a bit of that lens. And so, all right, I think that's enough of a preface. All right, so this is called Reconsidering Memory in the Digital Era. If I'm not speaking loudly enough, can everyone hear me? Because I don't have a loud voice, that hurts. I'll have to work with each other. Something there is that doesn't love an eye. It worms its way in, and unlike Taylor Swift, never declares it would very much like to be excluded from the narrative. It bends the story to itself, making everything else its subsidiary. So much so that one of my students recently called out no less a saintly figure than Elie Wiesel, the Holocaust survivor, as a narcissist. It takes one to know one, I would have shot. Had the comments come from a colleague or a critic. But my student was right. When we tell our memories, how often are they disguised, faintly or not, attempts at setting the record straight, reclaiming ourselves from past hurt and injury, marshaling our creative and intellectual powers to be, at least in that one moment of discursive action, more powerful than all the forces that have conspired against us, past, future, or present. So too it goes with history, the retelling of facts to suit our arguments, so that we and whatever readers we've persuaded to come along see what it is we want them to see. One wonders then, in an age with such arguments as they are traded and replicated, often in meme form on Facebook and Twitter feeds, how is that triad, history, story, I, transformed? Not all reports are good. Tied to the creation of an online identity made up of quotations, commentary, and images, these digital archives collectively construct both a story and an I, thereby reshaping our understanding of memory and history. A few academics, and one could argue that one is too many, have thereby exposed a view of the world that they did not mean to expose. And I'm going to show now some unfortunate Facebook posts by professors. So here we go. It can go wrong, folks. Even, and here is, here's one. So this meme is, if you can push this way. Hello there, my name is Jacob Rothschild. My family's worth $500 trillion. We own nearly every central bank in the world. We finance both sides of every war since Napoleon. We own your news, the media, your oil, and your government. I think you've probably never heard of me. So that is the old anti-Semitic trope that Jews control everything. Maybe not something you want to put on your Facebook feed if you don't want to be accused of making, okay, point taken. Next one. Next slide. All right, here we go. Also some typical anti-Semitic images. These are all from contemporary professors in the last couple of years. All right, but we're not. It's not a trial. I don't have anything to say about the particular choices. It's not really what this is about. But here we go. This is about, you have the large hook nose, and then you have all of the ways in which Jews are supposedly causing trouble. The Federal Reserve and Wall Street, internet spying, Hollywood and TV, law courts, cancer industry, pornography, wars for Israel, sex trafficking, and fake opposition. I'm not sure what fake opposition is about. All right, and the last slide. Okay, and that actually needs a little bit more. Okay, so this is putting together religious, Jewish, sort of symbols, not accurate, but specific. Mom, look, I is chosen. I can now kill, rape, smuggle organs, and steal the land of Palestinians. Yay, hashtag Ashkenazi. So, but a critique of Israel is perfectly within the realm of academic freedom and should be absolutely allowed. On the other hand, pushing things towards Ashkenazi probably goes a little too far. Okay, so there we go. So these are from former Professor Joy Kariga, lecturer Hatam Bazian, and Professor Michael Chikanos. These things came to my mind. By allowing these memes to speak for them, they tell a version of history and memory that others have found inaccurate, offensive, appalling. But had these writers been writing, would they have made the same mistake? Unlikely. So how were they lured to trade in their craft, the careful construction of academic argument, for a few pointed words paired with a striking image, allowing themselves to imagine that such unholy pairings could do their work for them, that the world would look away? This is a far cry from what Holocaust scholar Miriam Hirsch had in mind when she extolled, quote, "When we fantasize and expect from surviving images of the past that the memory tells something of ourselves, about what and how we and those who preceded us once were, that they carry not only information about the past, but enable us to reach its emotional register, that they require a certain kind of visual literacy, one that can decode the foreign language that they speak, or they will be heard by generations not yet born." And that's from the generation post-memory. She's speaking here of the few family photographs of those who did and those who did not survive the Holocaust in the black and white prison garb they're often dressed in, worn in camps, behind the barbed wires, or bearing the yellow star, the word Yuda blazoned across their chests. That our memories are flawed, every writer of memoir accepts as a challenge to be confronted, if not surmounted. Bell Hooks recounts in her memory a red wheelbarrow transformed into a red wagon, and from this admission of inaccurate remembering, she makes use of Audre Lorde's term biolithography as a way to acknowledge that while the facts of the retelling may be under dispute, complete accuracy was never the goal, but rather a higher truth, one that the readers will have to trust her to reach, despite her having confused a wheelbarrow for a red wagon. She describes autobiography as, quote, a very personal storytelling and unique recording of events, not so much as they have happened, but as we remember and invent them. And she furthers this: one memory that I would have sworn was the truth and nothing but the truth concerned a wagon that my brother and I shared as a child. I remember that we played with this toy only at my grandfather's house, that we shared it, that I would ride it, and that my brother would push me. Yet, one facet of the memory was puzzling. I remembered always returning home with bruises or scratches from this toy. And when I called my mother, she said there never had been any wagon, that we had shared a red wheelbarrow, that it had always been at my grandfather's house because there were sidewalks on that part of the town. We lived in the hills where there were no sidewalks. Again, I was compelled to face the fiction that is part of all retelling, remembering. I began to think of the work I was doing as both fiction and autobiography. As I wrote, I felt that I was not as concerned with accuracy of detail as I was with evoking and writing the state of the mind, the spirit of a particular moment. And that's from her book, Talking Back. Because she is bell hooks, we are inclined to go along. What difference does it make whether it was a red wagon or a red wheelbarrow, when Hooks is doing the hard work of excavating the pain and trauma and silencing experienced by African American women as they attempt to talk back to the forces that work to keep them quiet and subjugated? We accept these small inconsistencies, errors, slip-ups, and even contested narratives, just to be able to hear that voice speak her truth. But other memoirists have not fared so well in their attempts to appeal to a higher truth while stumbling over factuality. As readers, our judgments of memoirists who we perceive as having crossed the line from acceptable biomythography to insidious fabrication for the sake of self-promotion, or worse, can be swift and brutal. The actual motives of the memoirs in question can remain unclear. What to make, for example, of the Belgian writer Misha de Fonseca, who in her best-selling book, Misha, a memoir of the Holocaust years, claimed to have survived the Holocaust by traveling across Europe with a pack of wolves. As it turns out, as a child, she never left Belgium. Not surprisingly, there were no wolves. Her defense, as noted by the memoirist and critic Daniel Mendelsohn, is a baffling one, as she asserts, "The story in the book is mine. It is not the actual reality. It was my reality, my way of surviving." Adding, "There are times when I find it difficult to differentiate between reality and my inner world." And that's from her book, or her article, but enough about me. Oh, no, that's from Daniel Mendelsohn's article, but enough about me. Not enough, her readers and her publishers proclaimed, as the lawsuits ensued. One cannot, it would seem, feel one's way into truth. We cannot just tell any version of history that suits us. Or can we? Our current media landscape is one in which conspiracy-oriented interpretations, as we've just seen, a couple of current and past events proliferate at dizzying speed. Who can keep up? I confess to no longer even trying to stay abreast of the latest nonsense coming from the Grand Master of Conspiracy, the teller of perpetual untruths, our president, or, as my mother likes to call him in an effort, I assume, to put him back where he belongs, Trumpy. The rhetorical opening, after all, for his claim to the White House was the laughable conspiracy theory that Barack Obama's Hawaii's birth certificate was forged, and that Obama was actually born in Kenya. How such a ludicrous charge was elevated to the level of acceptable political discourse and eventually carried this conveyor of non-truths all the way to the White House remains a mystery. I first happened upon this problem a few years ago in a 300-level argumentative writing class. One of my students wanted to make the argument that the Sandy Hook massacre was a hoax, perpetrated by Democrats, a media event created entirely for the purpose of furthering their arguments favoring gun control. I had never encountered what seemed to be, on the surface of things, an ordinary student who had successfully made his way through lower division college coursework, unapologetically state views that I would categorize as conspiracy-oriented gobbledygook. Not knowing exactly how to have the situation play out, I allowed the student, along with his classmates, to give the required presentation on his argument to me and his fellow students. He cited multiple online news sites and many YouTube videos in favor of his point of view. These sites offered as evidence for the argument that the tears on the faces of the parents in Newton were fake, that the guns described by the police did not match the video of the guns used on the scene, and that the grieving parents were paid actors. After I allowed this material into my classroom, I felt that something important had shifted, that I had permitted something that I should have forbidden, namely that I had validated untruths as deserving of scholarly time and attention, as if they were arguments grounded in factuality. Unsure of how to interpret what was happening and how best to respond pedagogically, I posted my concerns to a group of friends and colleagues on Facebook. At the time, none of them, not the academics among them, not the journalists, not the fiction writers, not the mothers raising children, not the white-collar workers working in various industries, raised a single concern about my allowing the student's presentation to go forward. In fact, the views expressed on my feed or that any view should be allowed in an argumentative writing classroom. And all seem to work from an ideal of academic freedom in which every possible argument is allowed to be aired. I still felt uncomfortable, but could not find a way to articulate my concerns that would not either position myself as the arbiter of truth in the classroom, or that would rely on absolutist fundamentalist notions of truth that I, along with my community friends and colleagues, had long ago rejected. I left the discomfort I felt behind and went about my teaching and writing as usual, thankful to not again encounter a student's argument that forced me to question the boundaries of my teaching and my scholarship. And all was fun until Joy Carica and Chickenhouse and Baziak, these are the professors who post those things, and Trump. So then, one wonders, should a line be drawn? But whose? And how do we find it? Contemporary scholars, and this is then in my field, of rhetoric and digital media, have made the compelling argument that under the pressure of new media and its particular rhetorical dimensions and abilities, traditional rhetorical terms can benefit from a redefinition. In all the available means, Sheridan et al. Make the argument for reconsideration of kairos and offer a new term, that of rhetorical velocity, and in so doing make an argument for reconsideration of one of the 5 canons of rhetoric, that of delivery. This articulation in precise descriptive ways on how digital rhetorics have shaped and will continue to shape core rhetorical concepts has been immensely helpful to scholars, students, and teachers. In a similar way, I make the argument that a too often overlooked canon, that of memory, bears reconsideration under the weight of the destabilization that has accompanied the predominantly online phenomenon of fact-free media. Memory has been, in contemporary writing pedagogy, often considered a canon teachers of writing and rhetoric could briefly comment upon in terms of its historical significance, and then move on to the more relevant seeming canons of invention, arrangement, and style. Memory no longer seemed as important to emphasize in a writing-centric pedagogical environment where few students are called upon to memorize texts or speeches, and understandably few writing teachers include recitation in the curriculum. It went largely uncommented upon that memory in this context referred to a vast collection of shared cultural knowledge, topoi, that the rhetorician was meant to draw from in performing oral declamations from memory. With the dawn of the digital and the proliferation of alternative sites of information and news online, however, it is time for the significance of memory to be reasserted, as we can no longer assume a vast collection of shared cultural knowledge. Classical and medieval thinkers assigned, as scholar Mary Carruthers describes it, a crucial role to the notion of a communal memory accessed by an individual through education. Persons were citizens of their culture by virtue of their knowledge of that culture and history, stored in memory. To put this in another way, as rhetoric scholar Sharon Crowley terms it, memories are constituted by things everyone knows. They are truly commonplaces. In the modernist conception, rhetoric begins with rational inquiry, which occurs in the reflective mind of an individual and purposeful inquirer. Inquirers translate their findings into language that faithfully represents reality and minds that perceive it. Because reason is universal and language is a transparent reflection of reality and or reason, reasonable persons can understand the fruits of rhetorical investigation. In understanding, the persons accept them because their truth is guaranteed by the rationality of inquiry and the utter transparency of language. But that's the modernist conception. Many social media users, accidental historians, storytellers, and rhetoricians act as if this is still true. That is, they assume a purposeful inquiry. They believe that they can use language in such a way that it is a reflection of reality and reason, and they believe reasonable people will come to the same conclusions they do. They, myself included, are often shocked and outraged when the opposite occurs. Cue the ever-present online outrage machine when we are reminded that this is not the case. This leads us to a sense of powerlessness, as if yelling at those who see the world differently than we do, or expressing anger that they do, will somehow lead these people to see the world differently. Futile, but understandable, as there is nothing less than our sense of ourselves at stake. In staking our claims in history and memory, we posit an imagined community of shared values and perceptions. But as Crowley concedes, we can see a nostalgia for this kind of rootedness in culture. history and defining a set of memories. In many ways, people still fashion a sense of identity and consider themselves educated in a set of commonplaces and memories associated with the group they are part of. However, none can ignore the uneasy knowledge that different groups value different histories and memories, thus weakening all of our claims to knowledge, history, and
Yes.
Thank you. Memory studies is a kind of subfield in history now. It seems
Yes.
to me there's quite a large literature.
yes.
Also, my daughter sent a link to me that was posted yesterday at the Washington Post, putting the Parkland shooting and already accusations that there were paid actors involved there in historical context. This dates to the era of slavery and Ku Klux Klan hearings in the 19th century, and there have been accusations. I didn't know that deep history very well, but there's a long history of those very accusations that these were paid actors that were paid to give false stories of slavery and false stories of Klan atrocities and on and on.
I think the issue is, or the idea is that in the digital era, these kinds of arguments are being made by people who are seen as public intellectuals with some credibility. So if we have professors posting on Facebook what are essentially very old conspiracy theories that existed for generations, that breaks down a kind of a common sense that we used to have about what is acceptable in terms of a civic discourse and civil debate. I think that's, for me, what happened is that we have a kind of acceptance of conspiracy-oriented arguments. They've been mainstreamed in a way that has been popularized by digital media and has been accessed through digital media, that is destabilizing our basic foundations about what is acceptable in the classroom and in academia, let alone political discourse. Right? How is it that someone who claims a ridiculous conspiracy that Barack Obama was not born in Hawaii, how is it that he not only gets away with that but becomes president? That's destabilizing to our sense of truth and what's acceptable discourse. So yes, I agree that these conspiracy theories have always existed, but what's new is the level of respectability that they receive and the level of attention that they receive in academic environments and in political fora, so that they have real weight.
I would just add real quick that I think one of the things that they do before they destabilize credibility or value or interpretation, they destabilize through quantity in a way that I think is an important intermediary.
So you think it's the number of people they're able to engage and inspire?
In part, because I think what part of the medium is probably what's at stake in hundreds of years of this history, and part of the medium is a rapid dispersal. In some ways autonomous or through AI bots, not even human.
Right.
So that there is no value behind that. Right. There's no value behind a bot that retweets this thing. But if it's been retweeted so many times and there are so many numbers, then it's that number that posits something different than value.
Right. That's the rhetorical velocity and in all available means we're talking about the impact of the digital. It changes the game in those ways. Yeah. The reach, the speed.
Yeah, and I just want to throw that in there because I think it's somewhere in the middle there that I think the value takes us back to humanity, being a human, a philosophy of truth, like you talked about truth.
Yeah.
But there is no truth in a number, although mathematicians would tell me otherwise.
Right. That's I think therein lies the problem.
Yeah.
It's interesting that you mentioned that memoir. Because when you bring this back to print and books and commerce, Publishers are fine to just say that is a lie.
Yes, that's part of the problem.
And all those writers like James Frey and whatever,
Yeah.
if it's going to be legal cases involved, or they would just say this is a lie, we're pulping the books. Whereas once you get into these discussions, maybe it's our fault too because we're too polite to just say that's a lie,
Right.
while everyone else is saying you're lying.
Yes.
So
Well,
I think it's
that's-
interesting once it comes into commercial value, and publishers have a very clear idea of reputation and truth and fact,
Yes.
even though we may think that. But I have also written on this because I think there's something different out there, which is lying, and that is completely separate from truth and relativity and postmodernism. It's just lying, and readers know that's not okay.
I'm sorry?
Readers know that that's not okay. And if you look at, like on Amazon.com, reader reviews of these memoirs that there's been these scandals about, they're very clear. That's beyond the bound because they're lying.
Right. So, okay, part of the
And that's
problem is that we
interesting.
have all this, the digital bypasses, those fact checking. So people can publish
That's
without
right.
any kind of fact check. And people have access to websites and information now that hasn't been fact checked. So we've lost that intermediary.
Mm.
And then the problem is there are no fact checkers. I mean, there are fact checkers. We had Trump fact checked
Mm.
daily, and it didn't matter.
But what if everyone went up on those posts and said, what if everybody went up on those
Yes.
posts and but we don't.
Yeah.
We don't intervene the same way as people that have got a different agenda.
Well, that may be part of it. I mean,
Sure.
I think that in the paper you hear some culpability that I felt, that I didn't say anything. And it,
So
and we've been trained, I think, to say we don't have the right to say this doesn't come into the classroom or this is a lie. So yeah, I mean, I agree with you that that's part of the problem. And I'm not sure that I would do the same thing again now, post-Trump. But that was pre-Trump, so I didn't realize how bad things were gonna get. I thought that was just an anomaly, a crazy student. I didn't see this as a foretaste of things to come,
I think this is the rebirth of the call from media or digital literacy. I know there's a national convention here that it was this past year. It was in Chicago, which is kind of a cool place to have it. We had this big push a couple of years ago. We all need to check our sources, and of course plagiarism is a no-no, and so on and so forth. But why isn't anyone doing that aside from the academy? So we have this group of people, we've all turned in our references, our works cited, here you go, so-and-so said this, so-and-so said, I didn't make that up, that's the guy on my slide, he said it. But when we get to the current meme of last week, this generation was eating Tide Pods, this week they're telling us how to control our guns. I can't look at this anymore, just in case you're wondering, I'm a little frazzled by it. But there's no literacy factor to post the meme, cite the website that says such and such person was paid to be there. One of my students showed me a picture of a man, and he said, this man, which by the way is a man between 18 and 24, he's about this high, he has the normal haircut, doesn't look like any other man ever, was at 3 school shootings. He was a victim of 3 separate school shootings. That's either the most unfortunate person in the whole wide world, or we're not checking what website is telling us this information. So I think you're on the birth of the next literacy revolution.
So in terms of historical, we haven't seen this before. I wonder, kind of situating it. So for a bulk of American history, the newspapers were owned by political parties. And so actually we had more conspiracy theories in newspapers than we had actual stories. So I wonder in what way might this be a continuation of trends with any kind of media to disseminate useful information for political agendas, for example. And part 2 is actually just going to be my War Against Hamilton musical. But so part 2 would be Hamilton's enthusiastic support for the Alien and Sedition Acts and his xenophobia is not in that musical. So we also have another form of media that's not fact-checked, where we have Hamilton as this hero of American history, when in fact he probably would have been supporting Trump's immigration policy. I'm just kind of throwing those out there as, are we seeing something new, or are we getting Hamilton and partisan newspapers, and it just happens to be that people are on Facebook sharing it?
Well, I mean, what we have that's new is the digital sources of information that lie outside of the newspapers. So where people are getting their information, often the news is through Facebook. It's not through necessarily those newspapers, right? And the newspapers were wrong. I mean, they didn't predict that Trump was going to win. So Trump's victory was sort of a recognition, and there's a lot of, I think, hand-wringing over in the journalism sort of section of like, we don't know what's going on. So we're in a different moment because we have new media that challenge the central role of journalism and journalists that had it, So that, I think that's a challenge that didn't exist. Pop culture, yes, has always provided a kind of a different lens that gives us interpretations of historical events that aren't always accurate. And so we contend with that, we have literary, that's true for literary culture as well, not just pop culture. But where it's different for me, as I mentioned before, is that if it enters into the realm of academia, I feel like some sort of line is crossed. So that as academics, we have a responsibility as public intellectuals, let's say, to a kind of fact-checking, factuality, to stay away from conspiracy-oriented theories. And if we don't do that, then we've lost something, right, significant about our own role. And there again, people are very hesitant to play that role. So, I mean, this wasn't going to be, I said, as trial of these three professors, but, people are reluctant to say to professors, what you post on Facebook will matter, because we like to have a certain amount of academic freedom, and we like to separate out our public and private selves. But on the other hand, if we're using these tools, these new tools, to promote our worldviews, to brand ourselves, as a forum for our public intellectuals, and that material includes conspiracy-oriented material, then that's something that is new, or at least something that we should, as a community, be concerned about.
I would just sort of say in response to that, I think there's, everything is sort of good and bad, right? And for a while in the early days of the web, there was a lot of this term, the democratization of information, the democratization of, who can say what. And of course, the internet and now social media especially have democratized hierarchies of knowledge. And you're saying, well, we have a responsibility because, and in that moment, you're indexing a hierarchy of knowledge, and you did as well. I mean, we publish articles in journals that go out to blind reviewers that get scrutinized like crazy. The gate checking is extreme in academia, but we are all now reviewers of restaurants on Yelp, and reviewers of films on Rotten Tomatoes, and reviewers of books on Amazon. And people use those sources of information, especially now that they can be aggregated through big data. 4.5 out of 5 stars this show got, or whatever. There has been a flattening of hierarchies of knowledge. And that then means that there is a flattening or a democratizing in perhaps a pretty negative sense of the hierarchies that ensure a kind of faithfulness to truth. I mean, that's why this is the post-truth era. Not to be sort of media determinist, but to be media determinist. I think it is a function of media. I also think it's a function not just of a tool to give voice to others, but it's a function of the media itself. We're living in a remix media culture. So it's really easy to take a picture and put in some terms and the meme generators online. We're remixing media at the same time that we're remixing truth and fact and fiction, and I don't know. There's a
No, I
question in
think
there
that's-
somewhere.
No, I think the slipperiness there is the problem, and what at one point I say, if these writers had been writing, if they had been adhering to the craft, none of this would have happened, because this sort of thing would never get published in an academic journal. They could not make the arguments that they're making. But they did on Facebook, so they reveal something about their worldview that's hidden. They wouldn't necessarily see in the academic publications. So that's again why I think the digital media is something else. If they knew better, they would have just, not done it, or they would have set it to private, or who knows why they felt compelled to express views that no, in the traditional academic form, wouldn't have been accepted, but they didn't stay there. And I guess it is partially because it's too tempting not to. You have a forum outside of the academic community, outside of your students, and you can reach whoever you want to reach, and you can, so it's too much of a temptation.
I don't think it's temptation. I think it's changing how we think.
Could be.
Vannevar Bush said that.
Yes, maybe have one more question.
This is a little bit back to this idea of memory. So I'm thinking of some works that actually take place in India in the 1990s, and they talk sort of about how in reviewing media, people reflect and remember, even though they're aware of things that sort of from mainstream media that would contradict the narrative, that they still sort of choose, like the default is to remember things that fit their stories, right? That sort of fit their perspective. And so this is sort of pre-social media. And so I realize it's outside of, say, a Western context, but I'm still just sort of processing, is this in some ways, it's just kind of going back. Is it new? It looks different, but this sort of dimension of remembering what we want to remember and choosing to ignore things, or maybe we remember them, but they're sort of on the back shelf.
Right. I don't think confirmation bias is new.
Right.
So that's sort of what you're saying, is we tend to select stories and interpret facts so they will fit our pre-existing worldviews. And what people will say, and this isn't new, but what people will say now is what's different is we have these digital silos, and we have these bubbles, information bubbles, where we can more easily filter out any sort of information that doesn't confirm our pre-existing views. And that Facebook, for example, that have the algorithms where we will see material that we're already inclined to see, or our Google feeds are different because they depend on our predilections, and so your Google feed is not going to look like right. So they're technologically, that sort of impulse is being enabled in ways that we may be more sophisticated users of those technologies, and we may know that we're sort of being manipulated by those algorithms. But not everyone is as aware. And even if we know that, does that matter? So I'd say it maybe changes the way in which it operates. Not that confirmation bias didn't exist prior, but that new technologies play off of that in ways that are new, that we maybe don't completely understand yet, because we're in that moment.
And it keeps you in that moment. Think about it. You see something you don't like on social media, you can mute it, you can block it, you can say, I don't want to see this for 30 days. Or on this day, I don't want to see so-and-so because it's my breakup letter with the heart. Yeah, it feeds into it.
Oh yeah, and if that's your daily existence,
Right.
you have a lot of control of what you see.
Okay, well, actually, Trump conversation segues nicely to the next paper, and I know because I'm one of the co-authors of it. So now we have Joseph Boy and I talking about fake news, reality TV, and the Twitter presidency, understanding politics as popular culture and social media. And so as we introduce ourselves, we're political scientists. And political scientists, maybe even more than media, are shell-shocked. All of the textbooks have to be rewritten. And part of this discussion is figuring out what it means for politics. But it actually turns out after a few months of panic that our theories are all right. The textbooks are okay. So we'll talk about that. I'll let Professor Boyce. Yeah, thanks. And it strikes me that I had to sit here and rethink the entire first half of how, what I was again going to talk about, because I think that you nicely walked through how it is we're seeing a more rapid evolution of social media and technology that is impacting the way in which we're engaging each other within social discourse. Likewise, what I think that we're recognizing more and more, and I actually like the other day how you phrased this notion that we're not only seeing a democratization within media and sort of a proliferation of access, we're seeing a democratization of all sorts of our structures that we consider to be hierarchical. Within higher education, as we've been talking about, there's this sense that, but wait a minute, academics were the gatekeepers of knowledge. It's where people came to be able to get information, and we could control a narrative and present it to individuals, and that was the truth because that was ultimately vetted. Now actually what we're seeing is that students are walking into the classroom with technology and devices and access to information that we are no longer the experts. So what is our role? How do we begin to think about this? In part, it's the way that we think about the academy in relationship to democracy, and that it's not our role to teach information, but instead to teach people that democracy and to become a Democrat, small d Democrat within society, one has to begin to learn how to engage in information, which changes our role as not as providers of information, but as individuals who are facilitating empowerment so that we can have a form of moral education where people are, in fact, thinking about the consequences of their communication rather than just telling them that communication is wrong. We're empowering them with the tools to be able to navigate some of this. And so we're seeing some of the changes in higher education. I say that only because when we were thinking about the Trump presidency, we really did find that there isn't much change within political discourse. And I know that Dr. Dale is going to talk a lot about different examples, but he raised one earlier where it used to be that newspapers were owned by political parties or by political action groups. And so here again, we have echo chambers, right? We've got communities that are identified on the filtration of information. But what we sort of hoped for over time, and as we saw media policy change within the United States, we saw this what Edmund Burke was credited with calling the fourth estate, right, really begin to rise as this sort of watchdog media that would engage in an oversight of what was happening within politics, but interestingly had this symbiotic relationship in which they also relied on these individuals for information. And the same way for political leaders and political officials, that they saw this watchdog power and so saw the media could be adversarial, but recognized in order to be able to get our voice out there, we have to work through this fourth estate as a connective tissue to the people. Ultimately, what we're beginning to see now is that while the goals of information or what they're being used for hasn't really changed, we're seeing a fourth wave in democratization through the democratization of these institutions of hierarchy, media, of higher education, of other of those hierarchies that we would have once thought as being able to control information. And the result of that then is helping us to understand how it is that politics is ultimately changing and how we as intellectuals might respond to that. So with that, I'll turn it over to Tim to talk a little bit about some of the history and take us up to 4 minutes. Yeah, so I talked about the panic of political scientists because we didn't see the Trump victory. Part of that was, we're from Wisconsin, trying to get a handle on who Trump voters are. And of course, as you probably know, political scientists base predictions on past elections. And so people who didn't vote before and people stay home, that's what messes up the theory. So that wasn't a problem. There are some bigger questions that we actually, as we went back to our textbooks and worried, we realized we may have had it right all the time, and we just need to elaborate on the arguments. One of them is a seminal work in political science from 1997 called Going Public by a political scientist named Samuel Cornell. And in Going Public, he makes the argument that presidents in the 20th century, and it was 1997, but now we're 21st century, increasingly marginalized the media because the media became unreliable for the president. And so this going public trend really, I mean, I argue, we've been arguing about this now since that book was published. You go back to FDR's fireside chats. They originated because FDR needed to control the narrative. And so if you go back to the fireside chats as the unlimited Twitter of FDR's presidency, he needed to pitch the New Deal. And so FDR's presidency is successful in a sense because he goes directly to people. He cuts out any media, literally any mediation of FDR's message. And so he has a direct link to people's living rooms. And so we get the fireside chat as kind of a really good example of going public early in the 20th century. The example that Cornell uses actually to create a pinpoint, I like the FDR example, although he isn't as excited about it, is the first live press conference. That's JFK in 1960. And so that is JFK saying, I am not going to allow the media to tell people what I'm saying. I am going to tell people directly what I believe. And in fact, the civil rights movement is largely credited for both JFK and then Johnson for going directly to people and appealing to morality. When JFK calls civil rights a moral issue for the country in a live press conference, he's actually changing a narrative for a long time that had been, as you probably know, a North versus South issue, where there are some places where it's an issue and some places not, and you can make a choice. JFK says it's a moral issue, actually, and as we know, Johnson takes it up even more of a cause, landslide election 1964, also in part because Johnson goes directly to people. And so this process of going public, it evolves throughout the latter part of the 20th century with the creation of a press secretary that didn't exist prior to, I think it was Reagan who has the first press secretary. The idea is that the primary job of the White House is to communicate with citizens, voters, not to communicate with the media. And so then we have examples like Clinton going on Arsenio Hall, and that's the pop culture as politics, where I'm relatable, you can believe what I say, I can perform saxophone and look cool and wear shades. We have the Nixon example.
Yeah, when he was on Rowan Martin's lap in, and you know, what was supposed to be a skit making fun of him as he really awkwardly said the soccer to me, then it became a way actually that the viewers who saw that, it actually was a humanizing moment for Nixon, and it really changed a lot of the public discourse.
And so we actually get, what's interesting too is that the frustration with Trump is very similar to the frustration that conservatives had with Bill Clinton. When Bill Clinton goes directly to people, looks them in the eye and tells them a falsehood, and Republicans in Congress are saying, can't you see this man is lying to your face? And people are like, yeah, okay, whatever, that's fine. We'll show you the evidence that he's lying. All right, that's fine, we'll reelect him. And so that frustration, I think, it predates the Trump presidency. Imagine if we had Twitter and Bill Clinton had an iPhone, would we be getting the Democratic version of Donald Trump? That's hypothetical, but it's speculative. And then, of course, Obama is the first social media presence. So he has the textbook example of how do you capture social media to mobilize voters. And actually, that's one of the reasons why political scientists missed on Donald Trump, is they thought that Clinton and the Democrats were more masterful on social media. But it turns out Cornell's argument about going public is more right than even the more recent political science theories, which is that if a presidential candidate masters speaking directly to voters, that's what the social media presidency is capturing. Not necessarily the medium as a way to present policy, but the medium of connecting with people. So then being angry about the Trump presidency is also kind of a disillusionment about what democracy produces, is people who are willing to hear these arguments and then vote according to them. And so what we were wrong about on the Trump presidency, predicting the election, isn't necessarily what we end up being wrong about in terms of the media. Whereas the media used to have a mutually beneficial relationship with the president and politicians. Politicians would get access, the media would create more favorable stories. So we all know about JFK's indiscretions, but people didn't know about it at the time, even though the media knew about it. They just weren't reporting on it because they needed access. And so as the marginalization of the objective media is in part because politicians don't need them anymore. And so one of the interesting things about social media is that the technology is creating a new circumstance that had been happening for a long time, this going public phenomenon, but the technology is allowing it to have an even more radical role in our politics that it was, like I said, it had been eroding for a long time. And so finally, before we get to the last section of the paper, I think relating back to the point about Nixon and Clinton is that it also interestingly blurs the line between popular culture and politics. So we have a reality TV star as a president, a reality TV star who uses conspiracy to mobilize people. I mean, I think that one of the things that keeps me up at night is I'm not sure what Trump believes. I don't know that he believes a single thing, but then that's the reality TV as politics, is that what do you do? I mean, we were going to have a presentation on the Kardashians, but I mean, so what is real about someone's life in a reality TV show is a really interesting conversation, I think. And now we have a presidency that's a reality TV show. And so, I mean, this is the other thing, the reason we like coming to this conference is we're pretty sure the political science conferences are going to have to become popular culture conferences. Because when politics becomes popular culture and popular culture becomes politics, those lines are sufficiently blurred where we think we're now studying the same thing.
Yeah, and that's, you know, it was funny to me in reading Ernest Cline's book Ready Player One, which I think Spielberg has a movie coming out or is out about the book. But what I liked about it is in the future, you know, this kind of dystopian future, all of the elected officials, right, at least prominent elected officials are reality television shows or like sports stars, they're celebrity figures. And so, you know, even writing, I think the book was published in 2011, right, Kline's already sort of seeing this as a look at how completely immersive we are and uses that dystopian notion that of course exposes the kind of absurdity if we take this to its farthest conclusion. But what I want to argue here is that it's not just a matter of democratization or at least a proliferation of access to information and the ability of presidents to go public that's altering our way that we understand traditional politics in the United States. It's also the case that these changes within social media are causing traditional media to try to respond in some way. Right, that as a somewhat, at least as close as we can oftentimes find, at least within Western constitutions, the media in the United States is one of the very few that actually has a constitutional fixture within you know, our Bill of Rights, this notion of a free and independent media. But as they're finding themselves as being less and less sort of important in a lot of ways, what they're attempting to do is to capitalize on this proliferation of how people are dealing with information. And so what we end up seeing are a lot of, you know, news stories that begin to also blur the lines in traditional media between reporting out of information and engaging in a social commentary. And this debate was played out very publicly with Fox News when it was a political scientist and then a media advocacy group that looked at all of the information that was being put out, and actually found that that a lot of what was being accounted for in Fox News was this sort of social commentary stuff, and that there was very little actually reporting of just sort of headlines, facts, and Fox fully embraced that and said, yeah, what you don't understand is what happens within our commentary news is not the same as what's happening within our traditional reporting. So even though it was very clear that those lines were getting blurred, right, Fox very publicly said, yeah, no, there's a separation here, and you just have to realize that's what we're doing. And more news stations have adopted that approach. There's a lot of reporting out facts, but then immediately asking for, what do you think? Right, call in, we'll scroll things along the bottom, we'll read tweets when you're responding to the program. It's the news media trying to get that instantaneously engagement, and it's also empowering this notion then that if I have a perspective, if I have an opinion, I ought to be airing it out, right, because it's that important. But what I like about this so much, and what I think is also makes me very uncomfortable, is the fact that this is the fulfillment of the promises of liberal democracy. That when we see people directly engaging with information, right, this is the hallmark and the tenet of this notion of an individually rights responsive and protective regime structure as what we're seeing presented within American democracy. Now the question becomes, so how do we respond to it? How do we change to it? And I think that it's more and more by looking at our traditional institutions as no longer being the gatekeepers or the sources of information, but instead as seeing those also as being leveled and re-engaging people to get them to think democratically, again, small d, democratically, about the responsibility that they have in engaging this information. So I think it's going to cause a radical reconstruction of things like media, like higher education, and a lot of different venues in which people are publicly going to be engaging in argument. So I think that again, as a sort of a response to this, we're seeing not just a change within the presidency and that communication, but we're also seeing the media having to respond to this and then thereby changing the way that they're engaging within people and the cultural conversation. So with that, I don't know if there's folks have comments. I like that there was already so much discussion around some of these very issues.
I'll dive in. You talked about democratization of information and news and so forth. I also see centralization of the news in that very few corporations control a lot of media. And Facebook would be an example of that. And Google also, where they tailor, according to your past searches, what you will see. And Sinclair and the Australian guy, thank you. Jeez. Rupert, yeah, Murdoch News. I mean, there's a real centralization and diminishment of the number of sources that people actually get news from, it seems. I'm not so sure I trust that democratization meme at the moment.
How I guess, but I'm curious though, but why is that important? That now traditional news media outlets are being owned by these major corporations, when the reality is we're seeing in media studies a decline in overall consumption of hard news anyway. So people are looking for their information not necessarily from these major media corporations. That's not to say they have no power or influence at all, but I'm just wondering how much of the response back to centralization of media following the 1996 Telecommunication Act that enabled that clustering. But now we seem to have actually a better response than even governmental policy could do, because now those corporations are having less of a direct impact on what it is that people are going to be consuming.
But how were the Russian bots able to have so much impact? That's a centralization matter, it seems to me, or evidence of centralization, more than people just having access and being able to choose freely what they read. You really have to work to find news stories about foreign countries within the US, just for example.
What's interesting about that, though, is that I think Trump is an example of insurgency within those structures. There was no media outlet that you could find a single positive story about Trump when he was running. So the Russians were sending out bots, but particularly during the Republican primary, conservative media outlets were totally terrified that Trump would be the nominee. And so I think Trump is an example of and absolutely the corporatization of media is correct. But that the technology allows people to have blogs and tweets and direct contact with people running for office. And so I agree with you, but that Trump is almost an example of the opposite, where there was no positive media stories about Trump. I mean, the one conspiracy that I'm still hoping is true is this deep state thing, to believe that there are actually technocrats who are saving us from bad policy. If the media was serving their function, there were all these warnings that it was going to be bad. And that goes for like the leading conservative commentators, liberal commentators.
So there's a dialectic between the democratization and the centralization. And I think that's pretty complicated, it seems to me. Good luck with that.
I think you have to factor in commercialization. Habermas said that the newspapers no longer function as a check to state power. It hasn't happened since the late 18th century. You know, that we have a democracy that's based on this idealized view of the role of newspapers. That was true for revolutionary Europe, that we trace back our origins, our ideas about democracy to, but that has never existed since then. That no public sphere has been able to perform its role as a check to political power since that moment. So that we've had an idealized view of the role of the press since then. And so I would argue that it has to do with the commercialization. Well, Habermas argues that it has to do with the commercialization. And if you look at Trump, he says as much in the Art of the Deal. He says, there is no news that isn't bad for business. So it doesn't matter if the news about you is good or bad, it will bring in eyeballs and money. And so he learned early on to manipulate the press. He knew better than any politician, it doesn't matter if the reporting is bad, because you get free publicity, and free is better than paying. And so he understood that, and he has a whole passage in The Art of the Deal where he talks about creating this huge apartment building that was going to create a lot of problems, and it creates a big brouhaha, and architects are arguing against it, and people in the neighborhood are arguing against it, and he realizes he just got a bunch of free publicity, and it doesn't matter that it's all negative. So yeah, I think he's had a different relationship to the press because he understood the commercial dimensions of it.
I want to ask either or both of you, you mentioned the education has to adapt. I mean, we're talking about the need to adapt, and it's not just education, but other, information structures and societal institutions. As much as I am a media determinist around how these changes are happening, there is no question that within the apparatus that we are currently sort of all products of right now, you talk about the dialectic, the potentiality is there, and the only one that I can think of that sort of had its heyday a half a dozen years ago, but made it into the sort of popular usage stream, and you mentioned the sort of need to teach our students digital literacy, is Snopes. I mean, people got very good at using Snopes when their stories were coming through their feeds. I mean, you'd see some crazy conspiracy theory come in, and within 4 or 5 posts, there'd be someone who ran it through Snopes. So like, nope, fake news. Yeah. And that really was fake news, right? Trump gives a speech, and within 18 seconds of whatever claim he makes during that speech, Washington Post fact checkers publish the retraction, or not the retraction, but the challenge to it with, good, convincing information or whatever. But I don't see people in their streams doing with fact checkers what people got used to doing with Snopes. At least for a moment, for a while they did. Mm-hmm. And so maybe part of this adaptation has to do with making use of the affordances of the media and the platforms, but they're evolving so fast, our old brains don't keep up.
I was actually really excited about the conspiracy example because I really think that, at least in my opinion, the political science classroom is where you teach students not to be conspiracy theorists. So I actually welcome them in class and then talk to students about, with your example, I haven't used this word, but the classroom as Snopes, where you ask the students, okay, what is the difference between this theory about how something happened and this theory? And a testability and a scientific proposition versus one that is actually assuming it's not going to be tested. And so I challenge, and so when I say, tell me your conspiracy theories, there's no such thing as truth to any of them, and then they lay out whatever it is that they have. And what makes that different than me saying, the going public argument about presidents? And so when I'll challenge a student that says the shooting is fake, and I said, but the rest of your class is paid actors. No one here is actually a student except for you. Disprove it. How do we take that proposition and test it against something else? Well, that student may be inclined to panic and run out of the room because they believe every conspiracy theory because it seems cool. But I think that actually is what our classroom is for, not necessarily to give equal weight to everything, because we've never done that, but to actually let it come into conversation, which is actually the marketplace of ideas argument that Mill proposes. It's actually not that everything's allowed, it's not relativism. Is that you have ideas that are there because you're testing every one of them. So the power of the marketplace of ideas is that the correct ideas are going to emerge, not that we just allow everything to exist. And so I think it may have been uncomfortable for a student who just presented a theory, but now let's all disprove it. And using science, and when I present a theory, try to disprove it. This is what's scientific. So kind of that, what does inquiry look like? And that's what I appreciate so much about your presentation, is that reflection of the academy, that being irresponsible in social media is just like being irresponsible in the classroom. But it's just as irresponsible in the classroom to say this is true because I said so. Right. We shouldn't have done that from the beginning. That's the authority of the professor.
The problem is there's a loss of faith in that proposition in the marketplace of ideas, that the best idea will rise to the top. I mean, that's the problem.
Yeah, and I think for the media and just sort of reflecting on how they've engaged in some of these changes, I think you're absolutely right. Part of it is things are happening very, very rapidly, and it will take some time to adjust. And one of the The problems is that when you have this sort of traditional view of the media as, you know, really true gatekeepers of information, but then they get fooled sometimes by social media. I mean, one of the most recent ones was a series that was running in the New York Times where they were talking about Trump's guerrilla fighting television show. And it was somebody who, you know, who said, hey, check out, in Fire and the Fury, there's, you know, all these horrible things, and, you know, Trump has staffers that create monkey fights, and then Trump goes and watches them for 3 hours a day. And this got picked up, and it ran, and it went viral, and soon newspapers were running this too, as if this was part of the book. And so one of the problems is that they also kind of get swept up in that, and haven't really found a way to, how do we come back to that sort of socially responsible role, that fourth estate role, where we are engaging in that same kind of Snopes fact-checking idea. I think one of the biggest problems is that as that trust in media starts to erode and fade away, it doesn't matter how much fact-checking is done, because as Tim said before, people can look at it and say, yeah, I really don't care. And that becomes, again, I think where that call for thinking about democracy not as a system of government, but as a way of thinking and as a way of engaging and thinking about how we need to help people to understand their role individually within this larger marketplace.
We can also expand the discussion if there were other questions for others. We have a few more minutes, so we can, I mean, it doesn't have to, I thought we had really great presentations. Some of the panels here have been more disjointed than others. I feel like we had a really good conversation between our presentations. Did you have any questions for anybody else? Or?
Oh, I just thought that was so thorough. And in record time, and kudos everyone.
It helped though that we had two panelists that didn't show up.
Yeah.
So,
Actually, the sound would have solved all of our problems. Just there. Okay, well, thank you everyone for coming and the conversation.